Derek, in seeking some of the big themes in the philosophy of evolutionary biology, you talk about macroevolution in contrast to microevolution, which maybe many people are moving towards today. What is macroevolution?
So microevolution refers to any evolutionary changes that take place within a population over time. Usually it's smaller, kind of local scales. Macroevolution refers to any evolutionary changes kind of at the species level or above, at the larger scale over time. And for my money, one of the most interesting questions in evolutionary theory is just how those two are related. Is macroevolution just is macroevolutionary change just a byproduct of things happening at the population level, or are there other processes going on?
Yeah, that speaks to the whole question of reductionism versus emergence, et cetera. So what are the critical questions in evolutionary theory that could indicate a macroevolution that would need then to be explained either by just the totality of the microevolution or by something more?
Yeah, good. So one place where this comes up is actually the theory of punctuated equilibria, for example, where famously in the 1970s, Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould argued that when you look at the fossil record, which gives you a really unique perspective on macroevolution or what's going on at the larger scale, what you see are frequently, not always, but frequently patterns of stasis over long periods of time where, a species evolves and then, there's nothing much happening in terms of morphological change, for a long period. And that's surprising. If we just thought that macroevolution is a byproduct of change going on at the micro level, then based on kind of what inferences we draw from looking at observable evolving populations of birds or other organisms in the world around us, we wouldn't necessarily expect to see those larger patterns of stasis. And so that's an interesting place where the two maybe begin to come apart a little bit.
What is the nature of contingency in evolutionary thinking? And when philosophers use the word contingency, it means things that didn't have to happen but did happen, as opposed to necessity, those kinds of things that had to happen. So it seemed to me that everything in evolution is contingent. I mean but I think you nuance that concept of contingency. How so?
Contingency, as it's discussed by scientists and philosophers today, really traces back to a book from the late 1980s by Stephen Jay Gould called Wonderful Life, where Gould famously argues that evolution is contingent. And there's been a lot of discussion of kind of what he means by that.
So this means that if you roll the movie back and play it again, you get a different result, and if you did it a million times, you get a million different results.
Right. This is Gould's famous thought experiment of rewinding the tape of history and playing it back. Now, I think, though, that if we only focus on that, we might miss out on something interesting. So Gould himself was originally deeply interested in what you might call differential extinction and persistence of entire lineages. So he was interested in these fossils, from the Burgess Shale in Canada, where you have this really amazing, kind of array of different in marine invertebrates from hundreds of millions of years ago. Some of them persisted. Many of them went extinct. And so the question is, what if that sorting of whole lineages had worked out differently? What if a different lineage had persisted, and what if the one that persisted and maybe gave rise to like all of vertebrates had actually gone extinct? How different would the planet look?
So you define contingency in terms of unbiased sorting. So describe precisely what that means.
Yeah. So this process of differential extinction and persistence of whole species or whole lineages you could describe as a kind of sorting process. And one question you can ask about any sorting process is whether whether the decks are stacked in favor of one,
right.
one say in this case species versus another. Is there anything about that species that makes it more likely to persist versus going extinct, right? And that would create a kind of a bias in the system. Another possibility.
So what would be an example of that if we looked at the record
good.
and you concluded that there is a biased sorting?
Yeah, great.
So that would modify, it would be contingency with an asterisk of some kind.
Yeah.
So what would the asterisk say?
Yeah. So if one example of a possible bias that's maybe interesting to think about has to do with, say, body size. So we think that species with larger average body sizes have a higher extinction risk. So in a way, this is a bias against them. When environmental conditions get tough, when things get challenging, larger bodied species sometimes have a tougher time. And so we see, like at the end of the Cretaceous, all the large bodied dinosaurs and marine reptiles end up going extinct. Where small,
Might there be a time early on where increasing body size would be an evolutionary advantage because they would be stronger and be able to. So it's not linear in one direction or another.
Yeah, absolutely right. And this actually has to do with the micro versus macro distinction again.
Okay.
So,
okay. That's a good point.
So
body size in a micro sense would have advantage, and in a macro sense could have disadvantage.
Exactly.
So you have to aggregate these together in some complex. You need a Fourier analysis to distinguish the frequencies here.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
So you also talk about active versus passive.
Yeah. This is another really interesting idea about evolution that comes out of paleontology, really. So as we think about the big picture of evolutionary history, it's really interesting to focus on trends or changes in a particular direction. Body size increase in some evolving groups is one example of that. But scientists have noticed that there are different ways to generate a trend. And so one kind of trend is a more active trend, or a driven trend is another term that's used sometimes. And this would be a trend where, say, natural selection typically is causing an evolutionary change to kind of accumulate in a certain direction. A passive trend, on the other hand, sometimes called a random walk. People talk about passive diffusion models. This is more the idea that, say, size increases or decreases might actually be random. They might not be going in any particular direction. But if the lineage starts out small, and if you assume that there's a kind of a size boundary, say, mammals, for example, can only be so small, and before you run into physiological or even like structural constraints. If they start out about as small as they can be, there's no way to go in an evolutionary sense except to get bigger. And so the changes might be random and involve a kind of drift towards larger size.
Yeah. And so the difference, I would say usage there is if people assume that natural selection is the only way that it happens, that would be the active. But what you're saying is there may be an alternative way of looking at the record that is not driven by a foundational principle, which natural selection is.
Right.
There might be some other way
Right.
in which we would assess it, which seems pretty significant.
Right, that's exactly right. And this has been the source of actually quite a lot of controversy. So some of these ideas, contingency, passive evolutionary trends, raise questions about the importance, the pervasiveness of natural selection in evolutionary history.